Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Ives. I'm the director of the Center for Learning, Design, and Development at Athabasca University, and it's my pleasure to chair this final session in the LAK 12 conference. This is a panel session discussing a lot of issues that arise around the notion of data governance in relation to learning analytics. I have I'm joined by four learning analytics people with learning analytics as part of their areas of interest from around the world. And our objective really is to talk to you a little bit about our individual contexts and then to talk about our individual perspectives, because we've heard about multiple stakeholders and multiple needs that need to be considered in learning analytics projects. And so that's what we're going to do, and then we hope to be able to throw the whole session open for further conversation as a way of beginning a conversation around data governance and other issues as they emerge out of today's conversation. So at Athabasca University, we are doing a little bit in analytics. We do need to discuss the issues of data governance, data ownership, issues of privacy and ethics and control and access and all of those questions. I'm joined on my right first by Laurie Lockyer from the University of Wollongong. Beside her is Paul Hobson from the University of British Columbia. Beside him is Sabine Graf from Athabasca University. And beside her is Khlo from the Open University UK. And so with the experience of two of us from Canada and two from other parts of the world, we hope to be able to open this conversation today. The process will be each person will take a few minutes to describe their particular contexts, and then we will go through the panel again to discuss our individual multiple perspectives. And so, Laurie, you're first.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm from the University of Wollongong, as Cindy said, which is in Australia. I come from the researcher practitioner perspective. My area of research is in educational technology, so I'm interested in looking at how teachers can use technology and how learners use technology to facilitate the learning process. The University of Wollongong is a regional university in Australia, located just about an hour south of Sydney, on the south coast of New South Wales. Like many universities in Australia, it refers to itself as a comprehensive university in terms of its offerings. Like many universities in Australia, it's a multi-campus university, so we are located around the state of New South Wales, in Dubai, and we have programs with partner universities around the world in Malaysia, China, Hong Kong, etc. So we run a number of offshore programs, but our programs are also face-to-face, blended, distance, online, so our students in terms of the learning traces are all over the world and quite diverse. So as someone who's interested in research and the practice and how learning analytics can inform that, the data governance issues are quite diverse.
Thanks. So as Cindy said, my name is Paul Hobson. I'm Director of Enterprise Architecture here at UBC. I'm only slightly representing Canada, as I've actually only been here around about a year now at UBC. Prior to UBC, I was at Cardiff University for a number of years and worked quite a bit on initiatives with JISC. My current role is I'm largely responsible for helping the university develop technology-supported roadmaps for their future mission. Enterprise architecture as a practice at the university is still pretty young. It was only introduced as a sort of concept about 18 months ago before my joining the institution. We have a very broad range of activities going on at the university right now. So there's quite a lot of technology change in us, swapping out systems and maturing some of our practices. But equally, we've been working quite heavily in the last 2 years on really redeveloping the governance model that the university's got around IT and more recently around data governance. So my role here this week is one of a rank outsider, so I'm not directly involved in learning analytics. And my role is more of a bridging role, so this week, and particularly for today, I'm here to sort of bridge the gap in between the sort of hyperactivity of the research community and the somewhat more sedate pace of administration in universities. My day-to-day role tends to deal a lot more with constraints in terms of the kinds of solutions that we put in place, and a lot of the issues that we come up against being constrained by either policies at the university level or by the legal framework of British Columbia. And certainly in this context, then, privacy is probably at the forefront of our thinking right now, in that we have fairly stringent measures for personal privacy within British Columbia, which gives us something of an acute challenge from time to time in some of the systems and solutions that we're trying to develop, and learning analytics will fall under that. Just in my previous history, so as well as being in university administration, I did have a research background in satellite remote sensing and Earth observation, so some of the research that's gone on this week has been something that I've been able to buy into, so I'm not a complete dead loss.
Okay, hi. My name is Sabine Graf. I'm from Athabasca University. Athabasca University is an open university. We have over 38,000 students and over 700 online courses, so you can see we have a lot of data, and we are definitely interested in utilizing this data. I'm talking here from the point of research point of view. I'm faculty member at the School of Computing and Information Systems, so I'm having my background in computer science. And from research point of view, I'm coming from the area of adaptive and personalized learning systems. So my group is doing a lot of research on how we can make learning systems more adaptive, intelligent, and personalized. So we look basically into, on one hand, into user modeling, student modeling, how we can identify certain characteristics of students, things like learning styles, cognitive abilities, context of learners, and therefore we of course look into the log files and then behavior of learners, their performance, and so on. On the other hand, once we have information about students, about their characteristics, we look into how we can use that. On one hand, by things like doing, like making learners as well as teachers aware of students' characteristics. On the other hand, providing some personalized recommendations and also doing research on personalizing courses, providing adaptive courses that fits to their characteristics. With respect to learning analytics, we look into how we can empower teachers and learning designers, so people who don't necessarily have background in computer science, to also look at those data. Look at this data and being able to kind of ask questions what they're interested in finding those data. And we developed a tool that kind of connects to a database, well, more than one database, and then enables users to kind of ask simple questions, ask simple queries, and then kind of chain these queries together, so to get a more powerful tool. Okay, so.
Thanks, Sabine. I'm Doug Clow from the Open University in the UK. For those of you who don't know, we're a large organisation. We used to be a distance teaching university. We're increasingly an online teaching university. We've been interested in using new technology to support teaching right from the start, when new technology for teaching was having television programs, and now there's more exotic technologies than that. We have, depending how you count, but the highest claim you could probably make is about 250,000 learners online with us at the moment. I'm an academic. I work in a member of faculty. I work in a unit called the Institute of Educational Technology, whose mission is particularly in, a bit like Laurie, to explore educational technology, and particularly to deliver that into the Open University for the benefit of our students. So my personal role and the Institute's role is a hybrid one of research going straight across that divide into practice at scale in the university, and also with a view to staff development, bringing up the skills of other academic staff to improve what they're doing, and also inputting into the systemic decisions and the design decisions and the sort of work that people like Paul do. We've got a lot of activity going on at the Open University that you could call learning analytics. Not all of it is labelled as such, not all of it's connected up together, and a lot of it could be made a lot better if we pull in some of the ideas that we've been kicking around these last few days, which is what I'll be doing. We have processes in place to deal with managing research on students, not all of which we have to be careful about sampling students so that we don't oversurvey them. We've got processes in place for that. We sit as part of the, in the United Kingdom we have legislation about data protection, which is about privacy, but also about subject access to data, and also about privacy, what you can do with the data. There's also parallel legislation about freedom of information that applies to all public bodies and disclosure of information, and those two are potentially in conflict. I shall stop there before I come on to say more.
Thank you all for those brief introductions, and now you may be interested in jotting down your questions as the next part of the presentation emerges. In my role as the director of the Center for Learning Design and Development, we have a large staff of learning designers who are working with faculty to design courses for Athabasca University, and we have, as most learning designers would, questions around the formative evaluation of these courses, questions about what students are actually doing inside the learning management system and elsewhere, what the traces are of those activities. I see myself kind of as a translator-interpreter, and that's why we put this panel together. The questions that we started with are the questions that we started with at Athabasca University when we began to develop the tool that Sabine is talking about. We put together a multi-perspective team with members from across the university, institutional research, computing science, computer services, as well as faculty and our learning designers to try and develop this tool and understand. So part of this comes from our process of exploring how we might do this at Athabasca. It's very obvious, though, that everybody is having the same questions. And so it's time for us to see how others are answering those questions in their other contexts. Laurie, I think you're going to start.
So as I was saying, what I'm interested in is how learning analytics can help us address the educational problems and educational opportunities that we have. And those educational problems and opportunities are different depending on the context. And I'm particularly interested in the higher education setting and the more non-traditional pedagogies. So when you think about maybe a more traditional face-to-face situation with large lectures, maybe seminar tutorial supporting that, maybe traditionally large-scale exam-based assessment, it's sometimes a little easier to identify what the data is, but when you're looking at maybe potentially smaller classes, beyond, smaller than 100, and using a range of different kinds of pedagogies, what data is available and what data is not available create some questions about what can help facilitate the learning process better. So I'm not necessarily just interested in the students who are disengaging or dropping out, but I'm also interested in how we can make it a better learning experience for our students overall. So in some cases, there is data that is naturally occurring, particularly when we're talking about online learning environments, but in some cases, some of the questions that arose this morning in the keynote about what data isn't necessarily just there is important to me. Ultimately, though, when we're talking about student data, or as Eric said, the traces that students leave behind, in the questions that were formed in the paper that supports this panel, it's the students that own that data. It's the students' traces. And that's an issue for us when it comes to how we access that data. At the University of Wollongong, and I'm sure most institutions have some form of privacy and disclosure statement that the students sign upon enrollment, and it's questionable whether or not the students actually read those statements that they sign, but it's really assigning the data over to the university to be able to use for naturally natural educational purposes. When we start having more questions about how we want to look at that data, we need to understand whether or not the students know what we're doing. And from a research perspective, as we get into things and have questions, we don't necessarily know how we want to use that data. And even though we do ask students to sign those kinds of documents when they first enroll in a university, there's a need from an ethics point of view to disclose what we're going to do. So that creates a problem every time we have a new research project or have a new question to answer in terms of the organizational structures around the data. I've certainly had an interesting 4-month experience trying to get a fairly small PhD project through our Human Research Ethics Committee, which the idea is to draw upon the naturally occurring data of discussion forum data, grades and marks data, but also collect self-report data from students, so that data that's not necessarily naturally occurring. And trying to understand what that means in terms of the student ownership of their data, the teacher ownership of information about what they have constructed in terms of a learning experience for students, and then where that data actually sits in the university and who has control of the data. So it's one thing if you manage to get a consent from students to use their data for a different purpose than they may have expected. But it's another thing to identify exactly where in the university that the data is located, and sometimes while it's in ITS, information technology systems, the actual administrative control of those systems can be diverse across the academic space and the administrative space. And then understanding who is able to release that data even if you have consent. So it creates a level of difficulty at the early stages of this kind of work.
So at UBC we're in a similar position in terms of some of the work that we're looking at, and really there's sort of 2 major pieces of work that have been going on. One started before I arrived around information security, so there's a lot of focus around information security at a university level at the moment. And that's a sort of provincial drive as well. That tends to colour quite a lot of the thinking when it comes around to data governance. And what we found is in introducing more formal data governance, we're actually starting from a very uneven playing field, depending on where you look at different areas of the university. So UBC is like a lot of large research universities. It's pretty highly federated. So your mileage varies, basically, depending on where you end up trying to apply governance. So it's a longer journey for what we're trying to achieve over the next couple of years in looking for willing sponsors out in the faculty to actually start bringing along a little bit more maturity and a little bit more buying into data governance. So literally just starting with introducing the kind of terminology that people can start to understand. So introducing things like data stewardship and data owner as concepts. We're probably still a way off having that be uniformly accepted across the different governance groups that we've got. So I guess the state of play at the moment is that actually free-flowing data makes some people pretty nervous in the university. So where we do support analytics work and we do provide data, it's where we know we have reasonably good data to be able to supply out to well-trusted people. To be able to do that sustainably, long-term, which is where my interest is. I'm looking a couple of years out at where the university needs to be next, and so trying to bridge where you're all at with research now into what that might look like in terms of operations in the next couple of years. We still have a long way to go in terms of building our roadmap for our maturity around data governance. So we do have a framework in place that we can start looking at possibly moving the kind of analytics work into that operational world. But I've probably come away from this week with, it's probably a good thing, more questions than I actually have answers around what does this look like in data governance terms. So you know, we're pretty happy with regular data governance where we're dealing with transactional data of financial systems, and we're getting there around master data management of people actually having ownership of terminology and what data means. We have a good deal of work that's been going on for a while around identity and access management. So there's a broad sort of appreciation of data governance, but analytics, I think, outside of the pockets of interest that we have for analytics across the university is probably pretty early days. And given that most of the people that are actually busy with analytics work at UBC are in this room today. They'll probably agree with that. Everybody else is still busily back at the ranch. I think the privacy issues need a greater deal of support. So talking about ownership of data and with students owning their own data, one of the routes that's open to us in being able to actually broaden out how we use data is getting opt-in from students. And it's something that we're looking to do more broadly across systems anyway, because we're quite tightly bound by the privacy legislation here. But just having an opt-in box available for students to start using when they're signing on enrollment for their first course isn't enough. I think there's a much broader degree of enablement required to have people, staff and students, understand what the implications are of that and precisely what you're going to do with the data afterwards. So from my world on the administration side, the constraints that are applied mean that when people are using data, it can't be a free-for-all. So on the research side, it's a lot different in that we can have, it's basically pushed through an ethics route on the research side. On the administration side, it's much more policy-driven. And so everybody needs to know what the standards are that we're developing, and everybody needs to try and stick to those, hence some governance on top of that. In terms of questions I had from this week, just thinking about where this stops is something that's sort of troubling me. So the possibilities are pretty much endless, and in terms of how you phrase this, what could be done is very different to what should be done. And when we're in a situation now where sort of technologies in terms of tracking student interactions can involve us basically triangulating physical interactions by Wi-Fi down to sort of meter accuracy within buildings, it's great from a research perspective in terms of being able to look at that, but trying to sell that as an operational concern and looking at what that means in terms of how students feel about us collecting that data is something else. And so, just in closing, the particularly striking thing from this week was actually the closing question at the end of yesterday's afternoon panel, which was around, have we actually thought about the impact of this? And for me, then, I need to start thinking about that now and working with the senior management of the university to be able to be in a position in a couple of years' time to deal with that in a mainstream way.
Okay. I will talk about technical aspects on learning analytics projects, and especially on projects that span over the whole institution. So not only on particular courses, but looking into courses in different courses in the institution. And I want to highlight a couple of issues that I feel are very important. On one hand, based on the experience that we had with the project that we had at Athabasca University, and on the other hand, on what I have heard here in the last 2.5 days. One issue is definitely with data and which data we can actually get and which data we can track. And one issue that I think is very important here, and Laurie already talked a bit about that, is the integration of data. So we hear that there's a lot of data out there, and we can do a lot of a lot of learning analytics on different types of data. We heard about data of behavior of students in a learning system, behavior data in social networks, performance data, data about feedback of students, demographic data, and so on. So there are a lot of different data, and usually these data they are never stored in only one system, in only one database. So there definitely come kind of integration issues into play. We have, for example, at Athabasca University, we have our learning system where we have our courses in. Then we have, in some courses, we also have a content management system where some of the learning behavior is stored there. We have a separate system for social learning space where data are stored there. So basically, I think one very important issue is to consider that data are at different places and look into how we can integrate them. Another issue that I found very important is the completeness of data. So basically, to look into what is actually the things that we can track and what is actually the things that we know about the data that we can track. So for example, If we track students' behavior in an online course, we see the paths of students, we see which learning objects, which learning activities students visited. But actually what we don't see is what students did there. So if students just open a page, then basically what we have in the log file, that's exactly what we know. Students opened the page. We don't know if they really learned or where they go, maybe go for coffee in this time. So I think that's a very important issue to consider, that what are the data actually telling us? And even if we try to kind of go further and use more advanced technologies like, I don't know, eye tracking or so, then there are still some limitations. For example, if it comes to a student is thinking about something, there is no way that we can identify if the student is thinking about the content or if the student is thinking about something completely different. So I think that's a very important issue to consider and to see what are actually the data telling us, and what do we interpret into it, and what can we interpret into it. Another issue that I think is very important is about the flexibility that we need when we have learning analytics projects that span over the whole institution. When we say it spans over the whole institution, then we mean that we look into different courses. And different courses means that there might be different structures in these courses, there might be different teaching strategies used, there might be different pedagogy that is used, different types of learning objects that are used. So I think it's very important to consider this and look into what are the activities that are there, what are the pedagogy that is there. And on top of this, even if we have kind of learning objects or learning activities that are in different courses and that are the same, we still need to think about how are they used, what is the pedagogical purpose of that. So for example, if we take discussion forums, then there might be a course where we use discussion forums just for announcing things, where a teacher or a tutor is just announcing some issues in the course. We also might have a course where we have a discussion forum which is just there and where students can post some questions and teachers or other students can answer. And on the other hand, we can have another course where a discussion forum is part of assignments and where students are kind of required to write in, to post in this forum. So in all these cases, we have different pedagogy behind that, and I think it's very, very important to consider that when we do analytics. And I think one solution for this, and I didn't hear much about that in the last 2.5 days, is to use semantic technologies, to use some kind of metadata, which doesn't really need to be too complex. So, but I think it's very important to kind of have metadata and semantic technologies that tells us the meaning and the pedagogical purpose of certain activities. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, this is a great place to be. I'm the last speaker on the last panel at the end of a long conference. We're all tired, we've got low blood sugar, we want to have lunch, we want to go home, and instead of that you've got Doug talking about data governance. And actually...
It's very nourishing.
Yes, food for thought rather than the physical stuff, but the physical matters too. We are embodied people. I think actually our main strategy, I think, for thinking about data governance has been not to think about it. And that's kind of a potential problem. We must think about this stuff. It's hard. We've got more questions and answers. It's detailed. It's complicated. It all gets very nitty-gritty. But come on, we're learning analytics people. If we're either geeks or we can talk to geeks, we should be able to manage this stuff. There's a lot of existing good policy and practice that we can learn from, and as people have been talking about in various contexts, there's some quite stringent legal requirements that might come up and bite us if we don't do what we really ought to be doing ethically anyway. I think there's a tension in this area between two principles, two important and noble principles. One is about freedom from surveillance or coveillance or being data nightmare, and the other one is the freedom to have and use and get access to data and do fun and exciting things with that, or have access to data about what you've got there, what information is held about you, and those are codified in the UK as Freedom of Information and the Data Protection Act. there's a useful principle here around no surprises. The idea is if the data subject is surprised at what you've done, then you've messed up. And I'm not sure that we can quite aspire to delivering that yet, but I think it's a goal we should aim at. And there's another particular meta-level tension for us as a community. There's a useful principle about collecting no more data than you need to and keeping it for no longer than you need to. But of course, our whole community is about thinking about new ways of doing stuff with data that we never realized we needed before. So that's an interesting challenge for us. I think there's a fundamental issue about using learner data for metrics that is essentially, we'd like to say, the learner's data. And if we're using that for a purpose and they don't have access to that and they can't see that, there's a problem there. I think privacy is actually really important. My instincts are all for openness. Everyone sees everything the whole time. But learning can be a challenging, dangerous, scary thing. Lots of people don't want to be seen to mess up in public. And one of the things we can do in a learning environment is to create a safe space where it's okay to mess up and then learn from those mistakes. Anonymizing data is hard. There's a lot of clever people can put together supposedly anonymized data and deduce things from it that you didn't perhaps know about yourself. And actually a lot of the people who can do that sort of thing are in this room or in this community. So we do need to be careful here. And I think we might aspire to the models of consent that are coming out of biomedical research, where they have a lot of stuff about high standards about running ethical experiments with controls and for life and death stuff. And I've heard some people comment, oh, we can't justify running a control here where we don't offer the intervention because what if the intervention is good? Well, some of the biomedical stuff is about interventions that save lives, and they have nitty-gritty detailed stuff about when is a good metric for telling you when you should suspend the trial because you have the evidence to prove that the intervention works. I'm an educator at heart, but I think I'd balk at saying that it's literally a matter of life and death getting a good education in the short term anyway. I've also heard some terrible rumours of people doing what's essentially learning analytics research without going through institutional review boards or human research ethics panels or whatever that, and I'm sure those aren't true because that's the sort of thing that might seriously bite us if we mess up while we're doing something and something happens that perhaps shouldn't have, and then the punchline is that, and this was all done separate from the processes of governance that already exist. So I think we do need to be careful about that. And the difficulty, though, I think it lies in the boundary between research and practice. If it's clearly research, then obviously as researchers you expect to go through those panels. If it's clearly something that's just what the institution does, then it's very easy for that to get sucked into, oh, well, the student said we could have and use this data when they enrolled 3, 4, 6 years ago in our instance. So I think there's care needed there. And I think what we can do about this, and this comes back to a theme that I think Laurie's been big on, is about involving all those stakeholders, the learners, the teachers, the administrators, and even the policymakers in the design process and in the discussions about data governance, that it's a participatory process, not just of design. We know as from related fields about how to build usable systems, we should apply that by participatory design, we should do that for data governance too. So with that, I'll segue back.
Thank you. I'm sure you have questions. If you'd like to come to the mic, and if your question is directed to one or another of the panelists, then you could specify that. If to all or some group, please specify that as well. And then if others have answers, I think we should feel free to add them as well. John, thank you.
In Canada, there's the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council and also some other councils that fund natural sciences research and health research. They have a common ethics document now and a common ethics policy. One of the features of that policy recognizes that individuals have an obligation to contribute data for the advancement of society. How much do you suppose that could be used as a fulcrum, not a bat, to encourage students to contribute data? And under what circumstances do you imagine that could be turned on too hard?
Anybody want to address that?
I think it's well, there's a degree of precedence in that. So it depends on which you take first. Certainly from provincial legal point of view, that's what I have to listen to. So legal counsel of the university's interpretation would be probably slightly different. But I think if it's put forward as a very positive thing in terms you are helping, and over time there is a virtuous circle that's a good feedback loop into actually improving the learning experience, then most students would probably be happier with that.
And I think we tend to do that for educational research anyways, in terms of putting it forward as in a positive light of how it can potentially improve on education. But I guess it's a matter of being clear what we're using it for at what time. So it goes back to the no surprises issue.
There's one more thing I'd like to comment on, and again, picking up the model from biomedical research, there's strong ethics guidelines there about not withholding treatment from someone just because they withhold consent to take part in a research trial. And I think that's another one that we need to bear in mind, and exactly what you were saying, using it as a fulcrum, or I'd see it more as a way of beginning a conversation and discussion with people, a partnership, rather than as a, strong-arming, heavyweight tactic. So I think the partnership model is better than a sort of we know right and they don't. I think they know stuff that we don't, and we need to know that too.
And I think what at least what I saw in past is that if we kind of encourage students and if we kind of tell them what we're up to, and that basically we aim at improving teaching, improving learning for them, I think that's quite a motivator for them as well.
I think Doug actually has started to answer my slight concern that only just occurred to me, but that relates to something that Paul started. And I saw coming up in what Sabine was saying too. That we talk about ownership of data. But of course the whole point of what we're doing here is not data. We're actually interested in information and knowledge, and maybe even a little bit of wisdom. And I guess, does the fact that students have given ownership of data, or given us the right to use data, do we have an obligation to give them the information, the inferences that we make based upon those data? And I wonder if what we're doing here is trying to do something more, to discover stuff that we never knew before. And are we obliged to give that back? I don't know. Just a vague thought.
I think picking that up, since you mentioned my name, I think that we do have a moral obligation to, and I think we also have a moral obligation to do it carefully and sensitively, rather than just dumping it on people, because we also need to be careful about the level of claim we can make. We have predictive models, and we think that's great if they're 80% successful at prediction. What that means for an individual is very different, and is very contextual, and I think we need to look to the relationship between teachers and students as a partnership one, as a sensitive one, that disclosure of information that may be tentative, uncertain information is mediated by someone who can talk a little bit about that, and it's not presented as an electronic thing. The system says you're going to fail, and that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I think that means it must be right because it's on the computer, which does happen.
Yeah, that's precisely my fear, and it came up with George's talk earlier about hardening of the risks of making decisions too soon.
So I guess it's also about making good decisions in terms of what we want to know about. So just because we can do it doesn't mean we should do it. So what are the good questions that we have, and what sense can we make out of that, and how can we use that as an opportunity for students to learn and support that learning by revealing it to them. So I guess being careful about the kinds of things that we're looking at.
There's another piece too. If just by the virtue of time passing, learning analytics is done in a particular course, the opportunity to feed back the results or the inferences to that particular group of students is very limited. So then what would be the process for feeding back those inferences to the next version of the course or the following one again, so that eventually students will understand that they've profited by the experience of earlier students, and you know, what are the ethics there?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it relates to the core of teaching practice in many ways. You know, if I'm reading something by a student and I think, God, this person's an idiot, I would never in a million years feed that back to them. And I guess some of the inferences that we make would be potentially of this nature. And again, it's that if we provide it in a form that's dangerous, then I think, you know, there's potential to cause harm by not, trying to do a double negative here, not withholding data. I mean, it's better to keep it private sometimes. But of course, it's metadata, or it's information, it's data about data. It's our inference. And it just seems like a messy moral area, and one we need to address.
But maybe if we keep learning at the center of the conversation, then it becomes less difficult.
This is sort of a follow-on comment to John's questions. And it has to do with, you know, we're building universities, we're trying to teach students to participate and take responsible actions and govern their own learning and gain metacognitive skills. And I'd just like to hear the comments on at what point we quit being Big Brother and playing with the students' data and telling the students, well, we can look at this, you can look at that, you can't see this. At what point we just sort of say, look, the data's there, it's the students' data, they should have the right to look at and interpret their own data themselves. And so at what point do we move this program from, you know, analytics for the institution to analytics for the individuals?
That would be cool.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, in terms of personal ownership, one of the things we're trying to achieve with our students is for them to stand on their own 2 feet at the end of the day. And actually having some sort of personal responsibility for picking up on feedback, on analytics and on the inferences to do with that data what they can, I think it would be a very good move rather than it just being a complete push from the organisation to the student.
Also,
often I think the students are in the best position to interpret that data.
yeah. Yes, and also I think depending on the discipline, but in a lot of disciplines, the students actually have a lot of skills and effort and time. They care more about their own data than we care about their individual data, much as we might like to. They've got, some of them will have the incentive and the ability to do stuff with that we hadn't thought of, and I think drawing that in is a really exciting potential partnership model.
So when I, as a data miner, discover that Susie is an idiot and she's likely to fail, and that bit of information I could disclose or not, I could put it in a database somewhere so that she'll be afflicted with that knowledge, or someone will carry that knowledge about her for a long, long time. Obviously, there are risks, I suppose. There's also an issue of ownership. When the student themselves probably is the owner of their own data, I don't think they're the owner of inferences drawn on that data by others, I think formally or legally. And yet those inferences are sometimes basically attributed back to those individuals. I see that there's a lot of responsibility that we carry, basically, in making the kinds of decisions that we do as educators every day, but also as educators when we have access to the vast and growing array of data that we have about students. When we start poking into their social lives, into their personal lives, into their institutional data sets that we have about them, bringing in all of their past history into current judgments that are being made about them. All of those things, I think, put us at real significant risk and responsibility on the ethical side of things. When it's formulating data about an individual or making judgments about an individual. And so I guess I'm wondering about whether there should be a distinction made between doing learning analytics about an individual versus about a population or a bigger group.
Can I just pick up one point? It's a really interesting issue about the ownership of data versus the ownership of the inferences. And regardless of the legal position about the of ownership of the data, certainly in the UK context under our Data Protection Act, any personally identifying information creates an instant right for the person who is identified by that information to have access to that information and to correct it if it's wrong. So that I think should be our minimum situation. There are certain exceptions, but I suspect they probably wouldn't apply for the sort of things we're talking about. And that leads on to another concern that you touched on about going into the students' private lives. And there's good principles in data protection practice around not collecting data that you really shouldn't be collecting. And I think let's not go there. Don't collect data that you don't want to, that actually is only going to cause harm. Let's just not do it.
I think the difficulty with the not collecting the data is the porous nature of system use that we have. So we have combined system use where people are using edge technologies, third-party suppliers, where they're in there privately and they're also in there for study purposes. And so it gets a little bit grey. And so that was one of the points I made earlier in terms of where do you stop. So I think the judgment has to come in very early on in where your boundaries are, and you make them quite hard.
So we have to be able to identify what we're prepared to do about it too. So we can collect a lot of data, but if we're not going to be able to be in a position, and so I mean, in the first instance, I'm thinking about the educator or the teacher in the position to do something about it. Do we really need to collect that data or develop analytics that we're not actually going to use? And so that gets back to the various stakeholders who have to be in the mix of making decisions and asking the questions.
Looking around, I think we've all learned a lot from the conference, and Shane and company have put on a terrific job, but this is learning in the wild. There's probably not a lot of analytics that would actually show what's going on right now. And I've worked with other groups, been lucky, the most powerful form of learning is sitting around in rocking chairs facing one another in the Appalachian Mountains. So that sounds crazy, but that's real learning as well. Is there not a danger, but a focus on, because we can track the data, we've had a bit of a discussion, that our conceptions of learning focus on those things that we can actually track and have an impact on? Some of it's obviously pretty excellent work. And the other part of it, how do we stop learning and teaching groups or faculty groups from focusing all the time and effort and money on these sorts of activities, instead of it just being part of the activities of making better, helping teachers improve, daily in the classroom or online? I think that makes sense. I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's been touched upon earlier today in terms of, the fact that we're maybe been focused a little bit too much on the data that's available in the learning management system or the digitally available data, and that's, in most contexts, that's not what it's all about. So, and I guess that's the kind of thing that I was touching on in some of the projects that I'm interested in, is that it may be that we need to collect other kinds of data, and whether that's student self-report data on various measures that we're interested in getting perspectives from the students. It might be teacher generated data that is teacher observation about what's happening. I think we would be limiting ourselves too much to be just relying on that naturally occurring data that's in the digital form.
I think that it's an important issue. There's a danger of us falling into the drunk looking for their keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is, not because that's where they drop their keys. And the online realm and where we've got ready access to data is where we can look with the tools that we've been talking about. So that's where we've been focusing our attention. I think we do need, particularly as educators, to be aware that actually, learning is much more broad and big than that. And we have had people say that all along. We should hold on to it.
And I think there's one very important point that you said, that we need to kind of see what data we are actually looking at, so how complete are the data, and then obviously it's very difficult to get any data from kind of offline activities. So I think that's something that we have to consider when we look into learning analytics, and see that, okay, there are online activities and that's what we have the data for, but there are also offline activities.
there's a degree of unevenness that you need to be careful about as well in terms of the amount of rich data that's available. So it's very attractive, seductive to go into where we do have rich data sets, but in terms of extrapolating out across other areas where less feature-rich data, one size doesn't necessarily fit all.
I wanted to go back to the IRB conceptual space for a minute. I was talking to the chief social scientist of a startup about data privacy. They do a lot of learning analytics, and he made the observation that Facebook really had stumbled when they hadn't made clear what they were going to be doing with users' data. And he advised us, this was on the educational data mining and learning analytics brief, he said, you know, don't let the lawyers come in. Make sure you get your data usage agreements pretty well publicized rather than letting the lawyers come in and tell you how to do it, because they're going to lock everything down. So my question is, do we feel that the IRB folks know enough about what we can do with learning analytics to be able to really provide us the protection we need, or do we need some kind of code of ethics that we as a community create and adopt when we're doing our research?
Well, my experience with IRB is they tend to err on the side of caution anyway. And certainly the techniques that we're starting to use and the range of data that we're drawing in order to analyze that data and make sense of that data are changing. I mean, I think it's an education, a continuous education process both ways. So I think, yeah, it goes back to some of those first principles that we've been talking about in terms of disclosure and understanding.
I think it might be useful for us as a community to begin to articulate ethical points. There's been things that have come up over and over again as themes in this bit about learners having the control of their own and ownership of their own data. I think there's a particular LAK flavour to that that's unique, and it might be worth moving towards that, but as an ethical procedure and framework that we'd wave in front of institutional research boards and ethics committees. I'm not sure that that would help the process particularly, but it might. I'm open to suggestion.
Well, it does raise the question, though, of the IRB is another one of the stakeholders in the process,
Yeah.
and that therefore there may be some responsibility for sharing those new methodologies, those new approaches with the members of the individual institutional IRBs to so that they understand and they can ask the questions that they need to ask as we move towards, you know, confirming whatever our data governance approaches are going to be in each of our institutions. Yes.
When I first went to an employment panel in the UK, we were going to appoint somebody up. You go in and you're handed a pad of paper and a pen, and that's for your use in the panel. And I went in and I noted stuff down. I noticed that nobody else wrote anything on their pad of paper. And I said, well, what's that about after it? They said, well, nobody ever writes anything in an employment panel because those notes are collected, and in the case that there should ever be a discussion about whether the appointment was free and fair and transparent, those notes are used in evidence. So you never write anything in an employment panel. So the result is you're given this tool for use, but informally you never use it because it's too dangerous. You know, there's a kind of chilling effect on our use of media. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel here with what a danger for our area, where the regulation and the governance of data and the use of it might have a similar kind of chilling effect on the interactions which those media support, and whether there are any implications for that, you know, such as, well, we just don't use them, we go and have our discussion somewhere else.
Yeah.
Before answering questions, just to let you know, we'll take another 2 questions. Yeah, and we need to stop.
Thanks, Dragon. Anybody want to try that?
Yes, there is. Yeah, I think that's the tension. It's the and that's the second principle I was talking about, the freedom to do exciting new things and to take and use and create new tools. And it's a big tension. We don't. It's stupid to end up not being able to do something that would be of great benefit to everyone because we're concerned that it might be of harm when it isn't going to be of any harm. But I think we need to be clear about that. We also need to be clear about the evidence we've got of benefit and harm. And no, I'll stop because we're running out. We've not got a lot of time.
I think it does play back to putting the choice back to the individual. So you will get participants. You will always get participants, and you will turn some people off. So you're never going to get 100%.
As a matter of full disclosure, I'd like to start off by letting you know that I'm a lawyer, and you're right. Don't let the lawyers in and lock you down.
We love lawyers. Lawyers are great.
I'd like to introduce a caution into the conversation. We've talked about students owning the data, but students, once they enter an institutional process, become partners in their own education. And individuals have ownership rights, but partners have shared ownership rights. And when you think about institutions and about faculty and about the research that we do in that context, is that there is a shared ownership of these tracings that they leave behind as they do their assignments. And so your comment about the UK law saying, as you know, once you have individualized information identifying you with some particular tracing, that you have access to it, that you can correct it. But you didn't say that you could withhold it, or that you could say other people couldn't use it for other good purposes. And I think it's worthwhile in this context to really keep that partnership ownership of these student tracings in mind.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's a bit frightening asking the last question of the conference, and I wish it was a really important one, but I guess it's probably not. The issue has been raised a couple of times that there's a difference between learning and passing assessment, and that if the models that we're putting together are measuring whether somebody passes, that's not really what we should be doing. I would suggest that if the assessment isn't measuring somebody's learning, then there's really a problem there. Maybe that's a simplistic view. So my question really is, if that's the case, isn't that somebody else's problem to solve, that the assessment isn't measuring the learning? And if we accept that that's the case, then perhaps maybe we shouldn't worry about that, and what we should be building is models to assess, models to try and help people pass assessment, because fixing that the assessment measures the learning is a separate issue.
Yeah, I think I wasn't suggesting that there was a problem with assessment, although I'm sure there's a problem with assessment. That's an aside. I guess what I was suggesting is that from where I'm interested in terms of learning analytics can help in seeing other aspects of the learning process and supporting other aspects of the learning process that are not necessarily in the traditional models of both assessment and pedagogy in higher education. So I'm not looking to have learning analytics fix the problems of assessment, but uncover opportunities to support learning, teaching and learning better in different ways and in different contexts, if that makes sense.
I think there's, picking up on the thing yesterday about the difference between EDM and LAK being the difference between creating a self-driving car and a dashboard, I think the assessment question is actually the question of which direction the car's heading altogether, and just making the car go faster, whether it's under its own power or under a human driver. Actually, if it's heading in the wrong direction, that's not helping at all. So I think this question of assessment is kind of central to everything we do, and I would like to say it's not my problem, but it is my problem. I mean, I'm an academic, so it totally is my problem. I think it is a big problem, and it is the central problem. If we're optimizing for assessment, which is kind of where most of our efforts are focused, if that assessment isn't assessing the things we think are important, that's a real problem, and I think certainly I personally own that problem. You know, we've got to do something about that.
I think we're finished. Thank you. Will you please join me in thanking Laurie, Paul, Sabina, and Doug?